It's funny, even though we're more connected than ever, loneliness is something so many of us still struggle with. And I think your blog post, Lonely But Not Alone, really gets at that, exploring how even biblical figures felt that way.
Yeah. It is fascinating, isn't it?
Yeah, it is.
What really stood out to me was how the Post uses those figures to show that just being around people doesn't mean you're connected.
Right. So it's more than just being physically alone then.
Exactly. Like, the Post talks about Elijah and Job, both prophets, obviously, but despite being part of communities, they still went through these intense periods of loneliness.
Hmm. It's like when you're in a crowded room but still feel totally isolated. You know that feeling.
Oh, absolutely.
So it's always been a part of the human experience then.
It seems like it. And then the Post goes on to talk about David, when he was running from King Saul.
Oh, yeah, in 1 Samuel 27, right. Surrounded by, what was it, 600 men loyal to him but still lonely?
Exactly. It's like no matter how strong your bonds are, huge life changes can still leave you feeling alone.
Hold on, for anyone who needs a reminder, what was going on with David and Saul again?
Oh, right. So David, he was this young shepherd who became famous after killing Goliath, this giant, right?
Right.
King Saul, he starts getting jealous, paranoid even. So David ends up having to run for his life.
Wow. So even someone like David, a warrior, a future king, could still be brought down by loneliness.
Totally. It shows how when things get shaken up that much, you can feel adrift, even with support.
It's so relatable. Like when you move or lose a job or a relationship changes, even with people around, it's isolating.
You got it. It's like the ground shifts under you and you're trying to figure out this new reality alone.
And that feeling, like the post shows, it goes way back. Even biblical figures felt it.
It's a pretty universal human thing, I guess.
It really is. And it reminds me of Elisha, the prophet who followed Elijah.
Ah, yes. And his story adds another layer to this, right? Because he inherited not just Elijah's role, but the loneliness that came with being a prophet.
Now, what do you mean by inheriting Elijah's spirit? What was that like?
Well, in the Bible, prophets were the ones who got messages from God and had to tell everyone, even if the message wasn't popular.
Right, right.
So they were kind of separate from normal society.
Okay.
Could be misunderstood easily. Like when Elisha healed Naaman, remember?
I'm vaguely familiar.
He does this amazing healing, but still faces pushback. It's like even when you're doing good, it can be lonely if people don't get it.
Yeah, you can do something amazing and still feel alone if it's not received the way you hoped.
Exactly. And that feeling of being different, not fitting in, that's something we've all felt, right?
Oh, for sure. When you have an idea others don't get or see things differently, it can be tough.
And lonely, even if you're doing what you believe is right.
It's true. Sometimes doing the right thing can be the loneliest path.
Powerful way to put it. Now, the Post also talks about Anna, a widow who devoted herself to prayer after a loss. Her story is interesting because it shows a different side of solitude.
Okay, and to be clear, Anna's story is from the Gospel of Luke, right?
Yes, that's right. And what's different about her is that she's not lonely in the sense of being abandoned. Her solitude is actually a source of strength, of connection to her faith.
So she finds purpose in
Yeah.
being alone in prayer.
Exactly. And it all builds up to this moment where she meets the baby Jesus. It's beautiful how her faith and solitude come together.
It is a beautiful image. Shows that being alone doesn't automatically equal being lonely.
Right. And that's something we see in the Psalms too, like Psalm 25.106.
Ah, the Psalms, they're like a direct line to raw human emotion. And in that psalm, it's someone crying out to God from a place of loneliness.
Yeah, and I think that's why they still speak to us today. They capture that feeling of being alone, wanting connection, and that feeling, it's timeless.
It is comforting to know people felt that way thousands of years ago, even those close to God.
Totally. It shows how universal that experience is.
So if solitude can be both isolating and enriching, how do we navigate that? Where do we go from here?
Well, the blog post offers some answers, pointing to friendship as a powerful force against loneliness. And it uses some amazing examples from the Bible to show this.
Okay, this is where it gets really good. Let's hear about those examples.
Well, the blog post talks about some really powerful friendships, ones that were about more than just having fun, like David and Jonathan.
Oh, yeah. Their story's incredible. They went against everything just to be friends.
Exactly. Shows how true friendship can break down any barrier. And then there's Ruth and Naomi.
Oh, their loyalty is so inspiring. Sticking together through tough times, show what it means to be there for each other.
Yeah, a true testament to the power of female friendship. And I think these examples show us that real companionship isn't just about like good vibes. It's about offering practical support, being there when things get hard.
It makes you think about your own friendships. Do you have
Yeah.
people who really have your back, who you can count on?
Right. And it makes you think about the kinds of friends you are to others. The blog post
Mhm.
also talks about Jesus and his disciples.
Ah, yeah. That was a pretty special bond. More than just friends, it was about their shared faith.
Exactly. It's like a model for how we can find that sense of belonging in our communities, especially those that share our values.
It's about creating spaces where people feel seen, heard, and understood, which can help fight loneliness.
For sure. And speaking of that, the blog post goes on to talk about how loneliness can actually be a good thing, a catalyst for growth, even.
Wait, really? That's interesting. But how does that work?
Well, it kind of flips the script on how we usually see loneliness. It's like instead of something to avoid, it can be a chance to grow as a person.
Okay, I like that. But I mean, how does that actually happen?
Well, the post uses examples like Elijah going into the wilderness and Paul being in the desert. It's like when you step away from everything, all the noise.
You can finally hear yourself think.
Exactly. That alone time can be tough, but it's valuable. It lets you face your fears, look at what you believe in, and really connect with yourself.
Like a spiritual inventory almost.
Yeah, exactly. But it's scary, right, to face those things head on.
Definitely. But the Post argues that's how you grow. You become more resilient by going through those tough emotions.
And you realize that loneliness, as painful as it can also be a sign to look deeper inside yourself.
It's like the cave you fear to enter holds the treasure you seek.
Right. You get to choose how you react. Let it defeat you, or use it to learn and change.
The blog post also mentions Job, who went through so much suffering. And even with people trying to comfort him, he was still lonely.
It shows how sometimes, no matter how much someone cares, they just can't truly understand what you're going through.
You could be surrounded by people and still feel completely alone in your pain. And their attempts to help might even make it worse.
Yeah, and it makes me think of the prophet Jeremiah. He was rejected for the messages he had to deliver, And that feeling, being misunderstood, being the lone voice, that's isolating.
It takes real guts to speak truth to power, even when it means going against everyone. And that often comes with loneliness.
Absolutely. It's like swimming upstream, knowing most people won't get you.
It reminds me of all the people throughout history who stood up for what they believed in, even though it meant being different, being alone.
And we can't forget, they were still human. The post talks about Elijah again after he wins against the prophets of Baal.
Yeah, you'd think he'd be happy. But instead, he gets hit with loneliness and fear.
It's strange, right? But it shows how complicated we are. Even when we achieve great things, we can still feel empty.
It's like external success doesn't equal inner peace.
Yeah, you can reach the top of the mountain and realize the view isn't what you expected. The journey might have been great, but the destination doesn't satisfy you.
True fulfillment comes from within, from aligning with what you value, not from what others think.
Exactly. And what's so important about these stories, whether it's David or Jeremiah or Elijah, is that they show us loneliness doesn't discriminate. It affects everyone, regardless of who they are or what they believe.
It's kind of comforting knowing this is something people have dealt with forever. It makes you feel less alone.
It's a very human thing. It connects us all. So if loneliness is this universal, what do we do about it? How do we find meaning both alone and with others? The post seems to suggest the Bible has some answers. It does. It encourages us to embrace both sides, being alone and being connected. And it reminds us that we don't have to go through this alone.
Let's dig into those answers and see how they can apply to us today as we continue our deep dive into loneliness and companionship. One thing that struck me as we've talked about these stories is, well, how the Bible doesn't try to make human emotions all neat and tidy.
Right, like it's full of people wrestling with loneliness, even those who are really devoted to God.
Exactly, and I think the post really highlights that, showing how loneliness isn't just something you got to put up with, but it can actually make your faith stronger.
Yeah, like it's in those moments when we feel most lost that we start looking for something bigger than ourselves.
Right. You're forced to face your weaknesses, what you believe, and to look for connection, whether it's with others, with nature, or even with, God.
It's funny, isn't it? Feeling isolated can actually lead you to feeling like you belong.
It is kind of paradoxical. And I think that's one of the biggest things we can take away from this post. It's like we need to change how we see loneliness. It's not a bad thing, not a failure. It's just part of life.
It's a chance to grow and change.
Exactly. So instead of running from it, we can lean into it, see what it teaches us about ourselves and our place in the world.
And the post also reminds us that even though being alone can be good for you, we're not meant to always be alone.
Yeah, it's about balance, right?
Uh,
We need time alone and time with others.
Exactly. The Bible shows us over and over that even though God is there for us, we're also supposed to look for connection with other people.
It's like that saying, if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together.
Yeah.
We need each other, right?
We do. We need those communities where we can share our struggles, our joys, and just like lift each other up.
I love that.
Yeah.
So as we finish up, what are some things our listeners can remember from this conversation?
Well, I think the most important thing is that loneliness is something everyone goes through. It's been around forever. It's nothing to be ashamed of.
It's part of being human, right?
Exactly. And I think the other big takeaway is that the Bible isn't just about rules. It also shows us how complicated human emotions are and how even the most faithful people felt lonely and doubted sometimes.
And the post really pushes us to rethink loneliness. It's not always bad. It can actually help us grow and connect with our faith in a deeper way.
It's like an invitation to embrace all of who we are, the good and the bad, and to find purpose even when we feel alone.
So as we end this conversation, I'd like to ask our listeners, out of all the people we talked about from the Bible, whose story do you relate to most? And how can their story help you deal with feeling lonely in your own life?
And remember, even when you're alone, you can still find strength, meaning, and connection. You are not alone on this journey.
This has been such an amazing exploration of loneliness and companionship. It's a reminder that we're all in this together. And even though these are tough experiences, we don't have to go through them alone. There's so much wisdom in these ancient stories. Wisdom that can help us connect more deeply with ourselves, with each other, and with something bigger than ourselves.